Okay, welcome back to the next episode of our Salvation History series. And today we'll be dealing with a very, very interesting time in that history. So let's get started. Once I click in the right place. There we go, the church and the Enlightenment. And in regards to that, we're going to be starting with the rise of rationalism. And then we'll be covering two rather strange movements that occurred, Jansenism and Gallicanism. Then revolution, the defining event of the age, the French Revolution. And the church's reaction, which was, well, somewhat problematic. Okay, so let's start here with, I want to also say that there's a definite downward course to all of this. And um, we'll see how it plays out in the next section, but we have to admit that this is sort of a downward course for the church. So let's start with this, the rise of rationalism. And oddly enough, the rationalism or the Enlightenment had scholastic origins, that is, with the High Middle Ages, and was actually a product of the Catholic Church. And so let's begin with what came before, the general view of the world before, which was the great chain of being. And every culture has some equivalent of this. So all things, from the smallest to the highest, are connected in a hierarchy that leads to the divine. Whatever that culture thought of the divine, everything was connected to it. And so everything had its place. Now, there was growth and change, but it was always organic. That is, everything grew into a version of some predetermined form. So the acorn grew into the tree, and every tree is going to be different, but they all follow the same form. And in this, everything revealed God's plan. Then comes scholasticism, and its finest representative is St. Thomas Aquinas, of course. And with Aquinas, you get the triumph of rationalism in theology. So, and you get a separation of faith and science. So, Thomas says that the same thing cannot be an object of faith and science. It must be one or the other, but never both. This would be the charter for all modern science. And so scholasticism led to these tremendous advances in science and in industry. But they were advances that led some to challenge the whole idea of religion. We go from Thomas Aquinas then to a few centuries later, Francis Bacon. And for Bacon, everything could be explained by nature alone. You didn't need a divine explanation. So natural philosophy which is what they called science. Natural philosophy could explain all things. Okay, you didn't need scripture. So he proposed a new priesthood of scientists. Theology under this was futile and unnecessary. So the kingdom of man would replace the kingdom of God. Jump forward to Rene Descartes. Now, Rene Descartes is that guy who discovered coordinate geometry. So all those charts you drew in high school geometry class, well, they come from Rene Descartes. But they carried with them the idea of space and the heavens as empty and stripped of meaning. And he imagined the whole world as one vast machine. So again, theology was futile and unnecessary. Now, Descartes was a faithful Catholic, but he was following in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas, and that's how he got to this rather startling conclusion. So everything could be brought into the realm of reason and science. Well, that leads to the scientific revolution. And the defining person in that revolution is Isaac Newton. Now, the problems of the planets had plagued astronomers for millennia. Uh, every culture has had mapped out the movement of the stars, and they were very, very good at it. But there were these groups of objects called planets, and planet is Latin for wanderer. They just seemed to wander about the sky, and nobody could precisely predict their movements. But Newton solved it with a few simple equations. So the poet Alexander Pope sort of gauged the whole world's reaction to this Newtonian revolution when he wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Well, there was some rather interesting reasons for Newton's why Newton was able to discover this when other astronomers were not. And it's the fact that Newton was not an astronomer. Newton spent most of his life as uh, an alchemist trying to turn lead into gold. Well, other astronomers had sort of discovered the principles that Newton had, uh, but they didn't publish because they couldn't give any explanation for it. So Newton's great discovery is the inverse square law. So gravity gets weaker and weaker as objects um, flow apart. All right. The others had noticed this too, but they couldn't explain it. Well, Newton was an alchemist. And in alchemy, you don't need explanations because everything resolves to occult forces. So he just regarded this as another occult force. It didn't need an explanation, etc. But the idea that these complex movements of the planets could be solved by a few simple formulas led to the belief that perhaps all problems could be solved by mathematics, the problems of economics, of politics, of what we now call sociology, etc., etc. You could come up perhaps with a formula to solve all of these things. Well, this leads to the idea of deism. Now, what is deism? Well, deism says there is a God, yes, and he creates the universe, but he creates it like a watch, okay? And he winds it up and then disappears. Okay, he's gone. He's out. He's made the watch. He's done his job. That's it. This was the polite form of atheism. So you retained a God, but it was a God that had no real effect after his first creation. The world could now be imagined as a machine, and a machine that could be brought under our control. So the great chain of being was dead. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Well, in reality, there wasn't a revolution, it was just a continuation of medieval science. But everything had been interrupted by the wars of religion, and progress stopped as whole areas of Europe, especially the Germanies, were just in ruins. Well, it was a continuation of medieval science, but now in a from a different viewpoint, from imagining the world as a machine and one that could be exploited for profit. The organic view was dead, the great chain of being was dead, and man was now reduced to labor, just another resource to be exploited at the lowest possible rate. Now, this was a big change because whatever critique you can make of the relationship of master and serf, it was a human relationship, a personal relationship, and a lifelong bond. That was reduced to just employer and employee that existed uh, only for as long as the employer needed the employee, and of course, not the other way around. All right. You had another movement, and that was the rise of individualism. Now, individualism has Christian origins and is, in fact, a contribution of Christianity to the understanding of the human person. Because in the ancient world, the individual was just a passing phenomenon. Only family, tribe, nation, and empire endured. And they only fell through the faults of individuals. In other words, the individual was the weakness in the whole system. So you got the idea, for example, of eternal Rome. But Christianity reverses this. For Christianity, it's empires that come and go. But the individual has an eternal dignity, an eternal destiny. Well, the individual becomes just a cog in the machine, just the employee, for example, serving the needs of the employer, and only for as long as the employer needs him. So the individual loses all organic connection to family and community. And here's the real kicker, these individuals are motivated only by self interest. And religion now becomes not about the community, about the family, about the nation, about the empire. It becomes a private fantasy. Okay, maybe true for you, but it's not true for me. Yeah, it's not something you can argue about, or something that is the inherent bearer of truth. And the family itself has become a temporary arrangement. So you'll hear people talk about the nuclear family, but the nuclear family is not the traditional understanding of family. In fact, the nuclear family is a very temporary arrangement, so it exists only while the children are still children. This is in contrast to the extended family. So the extended family included, it was multi-generational, children, parents, grandparents, and maybe even great grandparents. And it was extended horizontally because it included cousins and uncles and aunts and those sort of things. Now the family exists only long enough to raise the children, who then go off to college and get jobs, in remote areas, and you see them, maybe at Christmas or summer vacation. So, individualism became the foundation of the dominant economic, political, and cultural theories. All right, we have to mention two rather strange movements that grew up. Jansenism, um, and this starts with the Bishop Jansen of Ypres in Belgium. It's a very Calvinistic view of Catholicism. Now, and that was the problem because the Augustinians were a big part of Catholicism, and well, Jansen, like Luther, sort of carried it to its logical conclusion. Well, he recanted in 1728, but his influence remained very strong, and especially in America, because his seminary served as the center for education for Irish priests. The Irish priests were persecuted, and the church was persecuted in Ireland by the English, so priests couldn't be educated in Ireland. They had to escape from Ireland and get their education. And um, uh, the Jansenist seminary was the primary place for the education of Irish priests, who then became missionaries to America. And when I was growing up, a lot of the priests were Irish priests. So Jansenism had a tremendous influence on American Catholicism. Okay, and then there was this other movement, Gallicanism, and this was just a continuation of the old national churches argument, which opposed papal control. And there was a continuing struggle, which we've covered here many times, over the control of appointments, over the control of um, church property and church revenues, over what documents from the Vatican could be published within the king's realm, etc., etc. Now, the national churches viewed the missions as an extension of national policy. So this led to that struggle that we talked about before with the Jesuits over the Paraguay reductions and these Chinese missionaries. But they did manage to get the Jesuit order suppressed in 1773. And this was a big loss to the papacy because the Jesuits were sort of the Pope's army, his intellectual army. All right, then comes the French Revolution. Now you have to understand the social conditions there. The aristocracy, the French aristocracy, had become isolated from the people, and it now largely resided in the palace at Versailles, where the king could keep a close watch on the aristocrats. At the same time, the people were falling into poverty. And this new merchant class was arising. It was kind of its own, a new aristocracy, and it was demanding representation. And you had this vast expansion of capitalism, which created a whole army of underpaid workers. So you had this exploding population without any work at all, or with work only for subsistence wages. And you had a government that was constantly in bankruptcy. Why? Because uh, uh, they insisted on making territorial wars, on expanding at the expense of their neighbors, sort of France first, or the Holy Roman Empire first, or Spain first type arguments. Okay, well, it turns out these wars are very, very expensive. So you had heavy taxation and high fees. And then with the French Revolution, you get the terror. Now, in Paris alone, 10 to 15,000 died on the guillotine, and another 10,000 died in prison while waiting to be guillotined. And there was a civil war with as many as 400,000 deaths. And there was this attempt to establish a religion of reason. So, in one ceremony, they took a naked actress and had her parade as the goddess of reason. That sounds pretty reasonable. Karl Marx had maybe the best observation on the revolution. He said, the people who wanted liberté, égalité, fraternité ended up getting cavalry, infantry, and artillery. And of course, they ended up with an emperor instead of a king. And this is kind of a critique of revolutions in general. Revolutions, a quick change to everything, usually ends up with nothing really changes except the nameplates on the doors. Um, but real change is always going to be a process in time. Revolutions really or rarely succeed in changing anything fundamental. Okay, the aftermath. There was a general war in Europe that lasted until 1814, but the peace could not restore the old order. The strict hierarchical notion of society, well, it wasn't gone, but it was severely damaged. And it fostered new movements for democracy that would play out over the 19th century. So revolution spread across Europe and South America. And at the same time, the church's hold on the people was weakening. But on the other hand, it did free the church from her alliance with the state. Well, what was the church's reaction to all of this? Well, let's look at one Pope, Pius IX, who ruled for an unusually long period of time, 1846 to 1878. Now, liberal Catholics wanted constitutional government, religious freedom, universal suffrage, and the end of the church's control of marriage and education. Pius rejected all of this. He did another thing. He claimed the ability to declare on his own authority dogmas of the Catholic Church. Now, usually that isn't how it worked. The dogma arises from the whole church and not just from the Pope declaring something to be a dogma. Well, in 1854, he declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. All right. Now, this was an idea um, that had been working around theology since about the 13th century, but there were various views on it. Um, well, the Pope proclaimed it by his own authority. It not was from 1854. It was doctrinal in the Catholic Church. And then at the First Vatican Council in 1869, he proclaimed the doctrine of papal infallibility. The Pope could not err if he was speaking from the chair of Peter. This was part of ideas called ultramontanism. Ultramontanism means ultra being over the mountains, okay? So if you were in France, Italy and Rome were over the mountains. So ultramontanism was the idea that the Pope held all political and religious authority in his hand. We've seen this before. Today, this is an idea that's still kicking around. It's called integralism in Catholicism, dominionism in Protestantism. Okay, and then he issues the Syllabus of Errors, Quanta Cura, in 1864. It condemned all forms of liberalism in no less than 80 articles. So, modernism, liberalism, rationalism, the separation of church and state, religious freedom, all of that was gone. And he condemned the national churches. He condemned socialism. He condemned Bible societies. And he condemned any idea of any limits to the temporal power of the popes. But the church was losing the allegiance of the urban workers who had other problems. All right, what does this mean for salvation history? Well, here's the strange thing. Nearly all these ideas in the Enlightenment had their roots in Catholic teaching. But in the Enlightenment, they appeared in a distorted form. So, in a sense, their victory was their defeat. Now, but the churchmen who were working at a reconciliation with liberalism, with modernism, were condemned. However, they were condemned by Pius IX, but they would triumph in the next age. And that's where we'll go to now. So let me make a switch here. Da, 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 da. This on, take this off. Okay. All right. So I need to click here. Okay, I think I do. Okay, the church and social justice, and this is what will define the next stage. Um, well, I'd like to subtitle this, How the Working Class Saved the Church. We'll deal with the Industrial Revolution, we'll revisit that. We'll talk about the rise of socialism and the revolutions of 1848 and the social doctrine, the development of the social doctrine of the church. And this was a big change. All right, the Industrial Revolution. To understand it fully, you have to really go back and look at the decline of agriculture. And this starts with the loss of the commons. Now, under the feudal system, each of the serfs had their own plot of land, but they also depended upon common lands. And on these common lands that were open to all the members of the village or the estate, whatever it was, okay, they could graze some animals. They could gather wood. Uh, um, and let me see, why am I not here? Oh, hold on. I sort of disappeared from my own. There I am. Ah, again. Okay. Um, that's the other thing. I turned off the wrong thing. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. So there was this loss of the commons through what's called enclosures. So the lords decided that they no longer needed the peasants. They could hire labor cheaper um, and take their lands. So the first thing they did was enclose the commons, which made the farms economically untenable, and it drove the farmers off the land and into the cities. Now, this system of common land still exists in parts of Europe. So I was in Romania about 10 years ago, and the forests were still common land, and people had a right to gather wood from the forests. And there was a forester who marked which trees could be cut down. And as you drove through the countryside, you see people still had big stacks of trees, branches and limbs stacked in their yards, and that would be their primary source for heating or cooking throughout the winter. Well, the wealthy forced the peasants off the lands, and the small farms were consolidated into estates. And this created this landless proletariat that moved to the cities, which created a labor pool of cheap labor for the new factories. And technology, the nature of technology itself changed. Now, in previous ages, technology was there to aid the worker, to make the craftsman a better craftsman. So think about one invention, for example, the flying shuttle. Okay, to weave cloth, you have to have a shuttle, you have the warp and woof threads on the frame, and you have to take a shuttle, throw it through the warp and woof, and catch it on the other end. All right. Um, well, then came the flying shuttle. And the flying shuttle was simply you put a box at either end and put a hammer in this box, which was controlled just by um, a little handle that the weaver um, could use to kick the shuttle from one end to the other. Well, this made weaving very much faster, and it also meant that you could have wider cloth. Why? Because with the old system, the cloth could be no wider than what a man could reach from one end to the other end. But in the new, with the flying shuttle, well, the cloth could be just as wide as you like. Well, okay. Newer technologies aimed at eliminating the worker entirely. The worker was now served the machine. So in the older technologies, the machine served the worker, now the worker served the machine. It was the worker was just that last little bit of the process that was not yet automated. And the work could be done by women for half the pay of men, or even by children for half the pay of women. So labor lost its status. The new system should have produced gains for all, but the gains were captured by one class. And the workers, of course, had no political representation. And they piled up in slums with poor diets and with no sanitation. So in these new cities, problems which had been solved millennia before reemerged. And I'll give one example, the night soilman. Well, what is the night soilman? Well, person who dealt with night soil. What was that? Um, there wasn't a sewer system. The storm sewers, but not sanitary sewers. So what did you do? Well, you did your business in a bedpan, okay? And then you dumped the contents of that bedpan into the cellar. When your cellar filled up with all of your donations, you called the night soil man. And the night soil man came in at night and they emptied out your cellar and they sold the product to the surrounding farms for use as manure. Now, can you imagine how unhealthy a house would have been with a cellar full of night soil? But that was the system. And the night soil men were kind of at the top of the system of sanitation. There's also the rag and bone men, the trash uh, pickers, things like that. All of these sorts of sort of whole ranking of professions um, that uh, brought what sanitation there was to the city. Well, the plight of the working class was um, written about in by Charles Dickens or Victor Hugo, novels like The Tale of Two Cities, which I'm sure you've heard of, or Les Miserables, if you've read the book or seen the musical. Well, all of this was part and parcel of capitalism. Now, capitalism was justified by the new philosophy and economic theories. So, the philosophy of individualism, everybody's only out for his own game. Well, that's the only purpose business has. That wasn't the purpose of business before, but now individual wealth was the sole judge of success of business. All of this was justified by a rather strange poem, The Fable of the Bee, 1714, Bernard de Mandeville. Um, it's a terrible poem, doggerel, a long doggerel poem. But here's what de Mandeville imagines. He didn't know much about bees or social animals. So he imagines this beehive in which every bee is out for his own gain, and that's all. Okay, so the bee lawyers looted their clients' estates, bee doctors sold quack cures, bee judges took bribes, bee ministers of state, uh, uh, took bribes from foreign bees, I guess, etc. That's all of that sort of thing. And but Mandeville concludes, thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. And that was the philosophy. If everybody pursues their own private interest, then the result will be a paradise for everybody. Well, except he allows, there's the poor won't benefit from this, and he also allows that it is only the poor who will suffer the consequences of the law because the rich can buy their way out. Nevertheless, he calls this a paradise. So the basis of economics shifted from virtue to vice. Now, virtue had been the basis of economic thinking since Aristotle forward, right up until the 18th century. But now, a successful state had to be a vicious state. And the economy itself, again, imagined as a machine. So, this was the philosophy of greed is good. Well, in response, naturally, you got the rise of socialism. But socialism is kind of a funny movement because it means a lot of different things. It actually has its origins in anarchism. It starts with Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who said that property is theft, and he meant private property is theft. Now, this turns out this is actually not controversial in this sense. All private property is a creation of the state. You cannot have private property without somebody guaranteeing the deeds and the contracts. But further, it always um, originates in conquest. So we stand here. We're in Irving, Texas. Uh, we're here because the Americans took it from the Mexicans, who took it from the Spanish, who took it from the Apache, who took it from the Mandan, or whatever the Aboriginal group was. And what is true about this piece of property is true about every piece of private property on the planet. It all traces back to the right of conquest. Well, Proudhon reasons that without the state, there would be no private property. There would only be the use of property. So you could only have as much property as you could use, and only for as long as you were using it. Well, and since most people can use about the same amount of property, some more, some less, but in general, property would be more or less equal. So the abolition of the state would mean the abolition of private property. Now, the state's functions could be carried out by just citizens joining together to solve their common problems. Um, so they would build their own sewer systems, provide their own defense when necessary, and there wouldn't be much need for defense because if there was no private property anyplace, there would be no predatory kingdoms, etc. Now, oddly enough, this is the origin of both of some doctrines which oppose each other. It's the origin of both communism and libertarianism. So both Karl Marx and, say, Ludwig von Mises or Milton Friedman all have their origins in Proudhon. But then comes Karl Marx. Now, Marx also took Proudhon, but he called Proudhon's system romantic socialism, and he wanted to replace it with scientific socialism. So instead of just doing away with government, first there had to be, excuse me, a dictatorship. And after this dictatorship and the workers came into control of the state itself would wither away. Now, this united both left and right approaches to socialism, okay, because it ends up in the libertarian state, um, but um, it has a period of absolute government power. So Marx joined them together. Now, Marx was an excellent analyst of the problems of capitalism, but he had no real system to replace it. People talk about Marxism as if it's a system, but Marx himself would deny that. Marx said communism is whatever happens after the workers uh, obtain control of the means of production. And it is not the job of any intellectual to tell them in advance what that looks like. So there really is no system called Marxism, and that's why existing communisms are always dash systems. So it's uh, Marx Marxism-Maoism, Marxism-Stalinism, Marxism-Castroism, etc., etc. That's because Marx himself didn't have a system. Well, the abolition of private property and the idea of dictatorship scared everybody, but it also allowed for all socialisms to be tainted with this communist label. Well, there were a group of Christian socialists, because by the 1880s, the church had lost tremendous ground with the workers. It provided no alternative. But some thinkers tried to join Christianity and socialism, or with other forms of wealth sharing. So Charles Kingsley, Henri de Saint-Simon, Philippe Boucher, Frederick Ozanam, Luigi Tapparelli, people like this. There were a lot of them. Um, um, But the most important, as it turned out, was the Archbishop of Mainz, Wilhelm von Kettler, because he would have tremendous influence on Leo XIII, as we'll see here in a minute. Let me suggest that the argument between socialism and um, capitalism is a false, on markets at least, is a false debate. Every economy, without exception, is a combination of socialized and market goods. And you can't have market goods unless you first have socialized goods. So roads, public safety, police things, fire, things like that, national defense, sanitation, etc., etc. A market has to presume that these systems are in place before you can even have a market. So, and nobody wants this situation. You have an emergency and you call 911 and you hear 911, what is your credit card number? Okay, so all markets presume socialized goods. So the proper debate is always which goods should be market goods and which goods should be socialized goods. So, for example, in our own situation, this debate will vary from economy to economy, from culture to culture. But in our own situation right now, a good example is healthcare. Should it be a market good available only to those who have the money? Or should it be a socialized good? Or should it be a combination of both? All right, then came the revolutions of 1848. I'm going to start a little bit before them, though, with the Irish famine, because it's very, very symbolic of what was happening. It was the symbolic of the divisions of wealth and religion. Now, I have famine in scare quotes because it was a strange famine. It was only a famine among Catholics. Have you ever heard of a famine that discriminated on the basis of religion before? Well, of course not. In fact, there was no famine in Ireland. There has never been a famine in Ireland. Ireland has always produced enough food to feed its citizens. However, there was a failure of one crop, potatoes. So potatoes were a new import from South America, especially Peru, and they came in hundreds and hundreds of varieties, but the farmers had just one variety of potatoes that they planted. And this meant that, well, if a disease arose, it would spread very quickly. Now, why were potatoes so important? Well, they were important because the um, the Irish Catholics were forbidden to own any land that had more than a very low value. All the rest of the land was owned by the English. And on these low values parcels of land, potatoes was the easiest crop to grow. And they needed an easy crop because they also had to work. The farm itself would not support them. Well, so when the potatoes failed, well, the food of the people failed. Now, the British government believed the free market could solve this problem all by itself. Well, it didn't. Well, here's some of the things they did. This is interesting. So, the potato famine was like any other disaster. People donate money, they organize relief efforts, etc., etc. And so they loaded up ships with food for the Irish people. The British government refused to let the ships land, and then when they finally did, the food had to be stored in government warehouses and could only be sold at market rates. Why? Because free food would impact the free market. You see? Well, of a population of 8 million people, 1 million people died and 1 million emigrated, mostly to the United States and to South America. Think about that. That's 1/4 of the population dying or immigrating. Put that in terms of our own country, 330 million. So, uh, um, if you lost 1/4 of our population, what our country would look like. By the way, Ireland never has recovered from the famine. Their population at that time was 8 million. Right now, it's below 7 million. Okay, well, that was sort of the curtain raiser for worldwide revolution. There was armed rebellion in most of Europe and also in South America and even in China. Well, Chinese um, revolutions had a wide variety of causes, but some of them were the same causes as the revolutions in Europe, South America, etc. What was scary about the revolutions of 1848 was it was not just the poor, but the middle class supported it as well. Now, there were a wide variety of goals, and this is where it became somewhat weak. So, fair wages, constitutions, a free press, the end of feudal duties for farmers, free elections, things like that. But different groups had different goals. At first, the revolutions met with tremendous success. They were very popular. But there were these great internal divisions over goals. Workers wanted better wages, farmers wanted the end of feudal duties, the intellectuals wanted a free press, etc. And the groups weren't often sympathetic with each other. They each had their own goals, but they didn't care about their allies' goals. Um, some termed this division in goals as freedom to read versus freedom to feed. And then the merchant class, they just wanted freer markets. They wanted to get richer. And so, uh, because of these mixed goals, the revolutions never had a single program. Um, all of the rebellions were defeated at a cost of at least 100,000 deaths and possibly more. But it started a process that would create the modern state. So much of what we take for granted in politics today begins in this period. And there was a renewed interest in the church in social questions. And this brings us to the social doctrine of the church. We start here with the reluctant reformer, Pope Leo XIII, 1878 to 1903. Now, he was from the Italian nobility, and his sympathies were pretty much with the nobility. But upon being elected pope, he starts with a social encyclical, Quod Apostolici Muneris, 1878, the year he's elected. Um, Now, this is a funny encyclical in that it's an encyclical about the working class that does not mention the working class. Instead, it uses the language of masters and servants, which even at that point had been obsolete. So, and he advised the servants to accept their lot in this life and wait for reward in heaven. Okay, this was totally unacceptable to bishops of working class dioceses, especially Kettler of Mainz, Manning of Manchester, and all of the urban bishops that had to deal with these problems on a day-to-day basis. They were not going to go out and preach about masters and servants. Well, after many years of working on the Pope, they get him to change his position, and this results in what is perhaps the most consequential papal encyclical ever issued, Rerum Novarum, in 1891. Notice, first one's issued in 1878, 13 years later it takes to get to Rerum Novarum. This is the foundation of all modern Catholic social teaching. And it's based on a call for a wider distribution of property. He notes that the capitalist system, the liberal system, had resulted in tremendous hardship for the poor. And he located the problem accurately, I think, as the accumulation of property in a few hands. So the solution was the wider distribution of property. And the mechanism for this wider distribution would be the just wage. Now, what was the just wage? Well, it was enough to support a family on one salary. Now, this is important because salaries were so low, pay was so low that women and children had to work just to keep the family afloat. But he added something else. It had to be enough to support a family on one salary and to save to buy property of their own. And it also allowed for government regulation of things like working hours, women's labor, child labor, safety, things like that, and for unions. Now, up to this point, the church had been either suspicious of or even opposed to unionization of the workforce. But now the Pope was calling for unions. He wanted the Christians to form their own unions because the socialists had actually done the work of unionizing the people. So most of the unions were actually socialist. So, but he did endorse the idea of unions. Well, this unleashed a flood of social, political, and economic thought in the church. Let's jump ahead to see how this worked out to 40 years to Quadragesimo Anno in 1931. Quadragesimo Anno means 40 years, uh, the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. Okay? It was an attempt to apply Rerum Novarum in practice, to bring it to ways that it could actually be implemented. But the church was now firmly on the side of the working class. Now, Quadragesimo Anno had tremendous influence on the New Deal in the United States. So Franklin Roosevelt, the president, called it one of the most important documents in history. And after World War II, Quadragesimo Anno sort of served as a blueprint for the social democracies that were founded in Western Europe. So the social doctrine became foundational to the church. Okay, where are we? Here's what I read from um, what we have so far. The, the church does need a strong institutional framework, but only to support the parish priest. The institutional church tends to be top down, but the true church is bottom up. When the church's concerns are principalities and powers, it tends to become a Game of Thrones. The true church is in the parish and in the abbey and in the hearts of the people. We are the church. We are the body of Christ. And everything we do, no matter how trivial we think it is, everything we do contributes to building up or tearing down this sacred body. We are created imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. And every action has meaning and consequence. We are the church. And we're going to see how this plays out, these ideas play out in our next session. Now, I want to state that what I just said was my interpretation of salvation history. And it's possible you could read the salvation history and come up with another interpretation. That's fine. That's how history works. Okay. Um, so you won't hurt my feelings if you, at all, if you come up with a different interpretation. Okay. And with that, um, we'll pick up the story and carry it into the our current age in our next session. Thank you all very much.